Jared Diamond, who almost needs no introduction, but who I will introduce properly anyway. As you know, he's a professor of geography at UCLA. He began as a professor in physiology. In fact, the first time I saw his CV, he had over 500 published papers in cellular physiology. I couldn't even understand the titles. But then he has since moved over into evolutionary biology and geography. As you know, he's the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. His second book after that was A Collapse, and then, as I call it, the trilogy, The World Until Yesterday, sort of rounds that out. He's been elected as a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society. He's a MacArthur Genius Award winner. He was given the National Medal of Science at the White House by President Clinton, which is super cool. And he's also the recipient of the Lewis Thomas Prize, honoring the scientist as a poet. Dr. Jared Diamond.
So today's talks are about the future of humanity and about the dangers that we face. And so I'm going to talk about how people judge and misjudge dangers. In my latest book, The World Until Yesterday, I wrote about the lessons that I've learned from the traditional tribal peoples of New Guinea, among whom I do my field work. The experiences in New Guinea that have taught me the most about how to conduct my own daily life have involved watching New Guineans deal with danger. To illustrate their approach, I'm going to tell you now a story about something that happened to me during one of my first trips to New Guinea, when I still had little experience of New Guinea's specific dangers and when I was still young and ignorant and macho in my attitude towards danger in general. I was surveying birds with a bunch of New Guineans on a New Guinea mountain, looking at altitudinal distributions, and we were ready to move up the mountain to our next camp. So we moved up a ridge. I was looking for a campsite, and I came to a place where the ridge broadened out, became flat. There was a steep drop-off at which I could stand and look out and watch parrots and swifts flying by. It was a great place for observing birds, and then there was a magnificent big tree in the center of this flat part on the ridge, so I told my New Guinea friends, let's pitch our tents under this tree. And to my great surprise, they got agitated, and they didn't want to do it. And I said, what's the matter? Beautiful place, glorious tree to camp out under. And they said, look, that tree is dead. So I looked up and, oh, all right, the tree is dead, but I told them, for heaven's sakes, this is a huge tree. It's been standing there for dozens of years. It's going to stand there dead for dozens more years, and surely you don't think that it's going to fall on us precisely, fall over precisely tonight when we happen to be sleeping out under it. Very unlikely. And nothing I could do, though, would convince them to sleep under that enormous dead tree. And yes, at my insistence, they pitched my tent there, but they went off about 100 yards away to pitch their own tent. And at that point, I thought that their fears were exaggerated, verging on paranoia, the term of psychotherapists for a condition that should be treated, namely exaggerated fears unjustified by the situation. Well, that was early in my New Guinea career, and as I got more experience in New Guinea, sleeping out night after night in the jungle, I realized every night you sleep in the jungle, you'll hear a tree crash down somewheres, at least one tree crashed down during the night, and eventually I did the calculation. If the risk of a dead tree falling on you on the particular night that you sleep under that dead tree is only 1 in 1,000, as I was telling my New Guinea friends, and if you adopt the bad habit of sleeping every night under a dead tree, then within 3 years, 3 times 365, 1,095 nights, you can expect to be dead. In that light, the paranoia of my New Guinea friends made perfect sense to me. It was not a clinical condition warranting treatment. I think of it now as constructive paranoia, namely a virtue that's essential for surviving in traditional societies. And that's the most important lesson that I've learned from New Guinea about dealing with danger, namely the cumulative risk of repeatedly doing something that carries only a low risk each single time that you do it. My cautious attitude that I've acquired from my life in New Guinea drives many or most of my American and European friends crazy. The friends who understand my danger are ones whose lifestyle exposes them repeatedly to danger, as has mine in New Guinea, and who learn from the deaths of incautious friends. One friend of mine who was an unarmed bobby on the streets of London, dealing with criminals who are armed and who had to learn to size people up very quickly. Another friend of mine, a whitewater river rafting guide with whom I watched another incautious guide getting killed, and a friend who pilots small airplanes and has seen lots of incautious pilots getting killed. Well, obviously there have to be big differences between how one thinks about dangers in New Guinea and other traditional societies on the one hand, compared to how you think about dangers in the United States. For example, of course, the types of dangers are different. In New Guinea and other traditional societies, the main dangers include accidents of the natural environment, such as falling trees, lions, dangerous insects, and exposure to cold or rain. Those environmental hazards are much less important here in the West, where we have tamed and modified the natural environment. Nevertheless, my wife and I were nearly killed by a falling tree in Montana the year before last. Other dangers of traditional life are violence, as Ian has discussed, infectious diseases, and starvation. All of those are much less significant now as threats in the West. Instead, we face a new set of dangers, such as cars, stepladders, heart attacks, cancers, and other non-communicable diseases. So you might say partly we've just traded one set of traditional dangers for another new set of dangers. But it's not just the case that the types of dangers in the US differ from the types in New Guinea. The overall level of danger, namely the risk of death per year, is considerably lower in the US, as reflected in our average lifespan of about 80 compared to 50 or 40 in traditional societies like New Guinea. A third difference between danger in first world societies and traditional societies is that the consequences of accidents can be repaired much more easily in the US than in New Guinea. For example, the only time in my life that I've broken a bone was when I slipped on the ice crossing Harvard Square, and so I limped over to a telephone booth in the square, phoned up my physician father, who came in his car, picked me up, took me to the hospital where I got my broken bone set and got fixed completely. In contrast, if, like some of my New Guinea friends, you break a leg bone in New Guinea, when you are 3 days' walk from the nearest airstrip, you may not be able to walk out of there at all. And also in traditional societies, even if you do get out of there are not surgeons to set a broken bone, and so you will probably end up crippled for the rest of your life. Hence, we in the West are not so concerned about dangers, because even if an accident happens, it's more likely to be fixable than if it happened in New Guinea. That lower level of danger in the modern world, combined with our expectation that damage caused by dangers can be fixed, has consequences for our thinking about danger in the modern world. Briefly, our thinking is muddled, confused. We obsess about the wrong risks. We worry too much about dangers that really are very unlikely to befall us and that kill vanishingly few Americans. And conversely, we don't pay nearly enough attention to dangers that are likely to materialize. We obsess about terrorists and plane crashes while we brush off the danger of falling while on a stepladder. Our confused thinking about dangers emerges from comparing our ratings of various hazards compared against the numbers of actual deaths or potential deaths caused by those hazards. Now, of course, in such comparisons, you have to be careful. The number of actual deaths caused by a particular type of hazard may not be a good measure of the seriousness of that hazard. The hazard's number of resulting deaths may be low precisely because the hazard crops up frequently and it's likely to be fatal, and we recognize it and take precautions against it. In that case, the hazard has a big influence on our behavior. We are very careful about it. It changes our lifestyle, and as a result, it causes few deaths. An example of that effect in traditional societies is among the Kung people of southern Africa, and lions. Lions cause very few Kung deaths. Traditionally, only about 5 out of every 1,000 Kung deaths was due to a lion. Does that mean that lions are not dangerous in the Kalahari Desert? Of course not. Lions cause few Kung deaths precisely because lions are so dangerous and they are encountered so frequently that the Kung are extremely careful about them, and they make big changes in their behavior in order to reduce the hazard of lions. To avoid lions, the Kung never go out at night. During the day, they walk around in groups rather than singly. In those groups, they talk constantly so that the noise will alert lions and they won't come around a corner and surprise and panic a lion. And they keep their eyes out for animal tracks. An example for us moderns of a real and recognized hazard causing few deaths precisely because some of us recognize it and adopt countermeasures involves experienced airplane pilots who do a lot of flying. They know perfectly well that their mistakes are likely to be fatal. And so every time that a professional pilot or an experienced pilot is about to fly an airplane, they go around the plane and check it out carefully. In contrast, most of us, when we get into a rental car, or even when we drive our own car, when I drove my car this morning, did I walk around my car to check it out? No, I jumped into it and drove off. We don't go around the car and check it carefully because mistakes or structural problems are much less likely to kill you when driving a car than when piloting an airplane. So you can't simply take the number of deaths caused by a hazard as a measure of the seriousness and frequency of the hazard. You have to estimate what the number of deaths would be if you were not careful. But even when you take that consideration into account, there's still a big mismatch between our subjective rating of risks and the actual seriousness of risks. It turns out that the hazards that we Americans rank highly, consider really dangerous, are terrorists, plane crashes for passengers, nuclear accidents, DNA-based technologies, including genetically modified crops, and spray cans, even though all of those things kill very few people. Conversely, we underestimate the hazards of alcohol, cars, smoking, slipping and falling, and home appliances, all of which do kill lots of people, tens or hundreds of thousands of Americans every year. So what things are shared between the hazards that we overestimate and what things are shared among the hazards that we underestimate? It turns out that we overestimate the danger of hazards that lie beyond our control, and hazards about which we have no choice, and events that kill many people at a time, and hazards that kill people in visible, spectacular ways that make newspaper headlines, and new, unfamiliar risks such as DNA. That's why we overestimate the hazards of terrorists, nuclear accidents, plane crashes for passengers, and DNA-based technologies. They happen to us. We can't control them. Conversely, we underestimate the hazards of events that are under our control, things that we choose to do or accept voluntarily, things that kill only one individual at a time in ways that don't attract newspaper headlines, and familiar hazards. That's why we underestimate the danger of drinking alcohol, cars, smoking, slipping and falling, and home appliances. We choose to do those things, and we think that we can limit the risks by being careful. We underestimate those hazards because the average person thinks, I know that those things can kill other people, but I am careful. And their risk for me, average me, is lower than their risk for the average person. But that's obviously nonsense, because by definition, the average person faces average risks. We tend to think, I am careful and strong. So those things may kill other people, but they are unlikely to kill average me. That attitude is summarized by the quip, we are reluctant to let others do unto us those things that we happily do unto ourselves. The really serious hazards of everyday life, about which we should obsess much more than we obsess about terrorists, include the danger of slipping and falling in the shower, or on a wet sidewalk, or on a stepladder, or while going down the stairs. All you have to do is read the obituary column of any newspaper any day, and you'll see that for older people, falls are one of the commonest causes of crippling, loss of quality of life, and even of death. When I reflect about the people closest to me over age 65 or 70 and what has happened to them in the last couple of years, about half of the people over 65 and 70 closest to me have had their lives altered or crippled or lost in quality or even killed within the last 2 years by falls. My wife fell and broke her collarbone. My sister fell and smashed her femur. A college classmate of mine fell a couple of weeks ago, went to the emergency room, where it turned out that his spinal cord was broken and he died. A couple of my best friends had falls that put them out of commission for a year and a half. One of my oldest associates at UCLA slipped on the sidewalk and will never walk again. And Michael told me that one of the speakers for our symposium this afternoon had a fall last night, which had consequences that you may see. So falls are a significant hazard, a major hazard for people over the age of 65 and 70. With that in mind, I reflect that today, I have already done the most dangerous thing that I'm going to do all day today, and that is, I took a shower. You may say, for heaven's sakes, Jared, you really are paranoid. What was your risk of falling in the shower? 1 in 1,000? Tops. And my answer, 1 in 1,000? Yeah, 1 in 1,000 is not nearly good enough. Just do the numbers. So I'm 77, and an American man who has already reached age 77 has a life expectancy of another 15 years till age 92. In my remaining 15 years of average life expectancy, my intent is to shower daily, and that means that I expect to take 15 times 365, or 5,475 showers. And if my risk of falling in the shower is, quotes, only 1 in 1,000, that means that I'm going to kill myself 5 times before I get to live out my life expectancy. And so I am really careful in the shower. That's why I've learned to pay attention to the risk of things that carry only a low risk each time that I do them, but that I propose to do frequently for the rest of my life, such as taking showers and driving. In that respect, I'm like New Guineans sleeping under trees. New Guineans who live in the forest will sleep under trees every night, and so they are really careful about what trees they sleep under. Many people, some people, object that my attitude of caution that I learned from New Guineans must be paralyzing, and they think perhaps I'm always thinking about what could go wrong, and so I don't do anything. I sit in the corner of my bedroom, and I never go to New Guinea. No. Instead, I operate with constructive paranoia, like New Guineans. Despite the hazards of falling trees, New Guineans still do camp out in the forest, but they are careful never to camp out under a dead tree. And similarly, I don't avoid taking showers. I still do take my daily shower, but I pay attention and I take it carefully. I'm concerned, I'm constructively paranoid about showers and stepladders and cars, and I don't sweat it about terrorists and nuclear accidents. That's one thing that I've learned from the traditional tribal societies with which I've been working in New Guinea. But New Guinea societies are just one example of traditional societies of which there are still lots left around the world, in contrast to the modern societies in which we live, industrialized with large populations and centralized government. And in fact, around the world, until 12,000 years ago, all societies were traditional tribal societies living at low population densities without centralized government. But there are still many of these traditional societies left in New Guinea and in the Amazon that we can observe and learn from their behavior. Many of us in modern societies tend to think of tribal societies like New Guineans either as primitive brutes who should be driven off the land and dragged into the modern age or exterminated or helped to die out as quickly as possible. Or at the opposite extreme, there are many people in modern society, particularly educated liberals, who go to the opposite extreme and think of tribal people as green, gentle, tree-hugging, friendly environmentalists. In fact, neither of those misconceptions is correct. Tribal peoples are neither primitive brutes nor noble peace lovers. They are people living under different circumstances from us. They face universal human problems just as we do. Problems of raising children, staying healthy, growing old, settling disputes, facing dangers. Tribal peoples represent thousands of tribal peoples represent thousands of natural experiments in how to construct a human society. They're all different. The 1,000 tribes of New Guinea are different from each other, and those thousands of natural experiments mean that some of them may have thought of solutions to universal human problems different from the solutions that we practice, solutions from which we can learn. The fact that we have more powerful technologies, that we have atomic bombs and writings and presidents, doesn't mean that we have figured out better ways of raising our children and staying healthy and remaining happy and settling disputes. So I'm going to conclude by giving you 3 or 4 more examples besides what I've talked about today, dangers of things that one can learn to guide your lives for the future from traditional societies, and things that I've learned watching traditional people in New Guinea. One is the universal human problem of bringing up children. New Guineans in general tend to bring up children differently from how we do in our modern society with our helicopter parents and micromanagement of our children. And this was something that influenced my wife and me when we brought up our own kids. In New Guinea, children are generally allowed to make their own choices. They're considered to have the same responsibilities as adults, but with different experience and different bodies, but they got to learn to make their own mistakes and their own experience. And so New Guinea children develop social skills that we would consider precocious. By the age of 5 or 10, New Guinea kids are able to bargain with me, negotiate. New Guinea parents never spank their children. Among the pygmies of the African rainforest, if one parent hits a child once, that's grounds for divorce. And the result is that the New Guinea children that I've observed end up with virtues that we would like to see our own children acquire, but that we prevent our children from acquiring by limiting their choices and by hovering over them. An example from my own experience is that when one of our sons, Max, was 3 years old, so we were letting our kids choose what they want as long as it was not dangerous. And Max, while we were out on a walk, he saw his first live snake. And it was love at first sight. And he demanded his own personal private pet snake. Well, all right, this is a child who's expressing his will. Neither my wife nor I were into snakes, but all right, if he wants a snake, we'll get him a non-poisonous snake, a little one as a pet. And of course, one was not enough because Max is a twin, and twins, any of you are parents of twins know that if one twin wants something, the other twin has got to have it. Joshua then needed his own personal private pet snake, and then there were frogs, and then there were salamanders, and then there were skinks and other stuff until in our house we had 147 pet reptiles and amphibians. But Max had a chance to try out what he wanted, and over the course of a decade, the number of reptiles and amphibians gradually declined as he de-accessioned them and as he died off. So he's now down to one turtle that he's had for 25 years. All right, this is a boy who had learned to make his own choices. And the result of it is that after he graduating college, he did not yet know what he wanted to do. And then one day when we were on a cruise ship where phone calls cost $15 a minute, Max called us up and said, "Mommy and Daddy, I've decided what I want to do. I want to become a chef and enter culinary school." And we said, "That's very good. We'll talk about it when we come back." And he said, "No, the tuition is due tomorrow. Can I please have..." All right, so, but that was a boy who had learned to make his own choices, and he is now a chef after having exercised his choices by acquiring snakes. So, one area in which I've learned from watching traditional New Guinea parents bring up their children is allowing children to make their own choices, which goes counter to the trend in modern American society where children are micromanaged and they're told that at 4 o'clock it's your soccer practice and 5 o'clock homework, at 6 o'clock dinner and 7 o'clock more homework, 7:30 and then 8 o'clock you go to sleep. How can a child learn to be socially responsible and make its own choices if you do that to a child? Another area that I've learned from New Guineans is in staying healthy. In traditional New Guinea, just before I arrived in New Guinea, a study was carried out in the main hospital in the New Guinea capital, Port Moresby, and out of 2,000 hospital admissions, there was not a single admission of a New Guinean for diabetes, heart disease. There were 3 admissions due to stroke, and they were all, it turned out, not of New Guineans, but of non-New Guinea visitors. Whereas the vast majority of us here, 95% of us here in this room, are going to die of these non-communicable diseases: diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and cancer. Why is it that New Guineans don't die of them at all? But why is it that when New Guineans adopt the Western lifestyle and live in cities and eat in supermarkets, they too very quickly start to contract diabetes, heart disease, and stroke? The answer is not that New Guineans die too young of other things to contract diabetes and heart disease. Instead, when you compare Americans and New Guineans at the same age, the frequency of heart disease, diabetes, and stroke is far higher in the United States and in Western societies than in traditional societies. The reason is differences in lifestyle, and we understand what those differences in lifestyle are. They are that in traditional society, people are physically much more vigorous, they eat less, they do not consume, they don't have the opportunity to consume salt and sugar, they have a much higher fiber diet. And those of us in the West who go on to these traditional-like diets and exercise and don't use salt and don't use sugar, my wife and I don't have a salt shaker or sugar shaker in our kitchen on the table. Now, the result is improvement of lifestyle in the West. So this is an area where, for the future, you can improve your own life prospects by learning from traditional societies. Next last example I wanted to mention is settling disputes. Any of you who've been involved with the American court systems, any of you who have had the misfortune to get divorced or to be involved in an inheritance dispute with your siblings or parents or children, know that the American court system, First World court systems in general, do not care at all about the emotional happiness of the people going through the court system. All that the courts care about is right and wrong and asserting a monopoly of the state on force. And the result is that any of you who've gone through a divorce or inheritance dispute know that you end up miserable, and you will probably hate the person with whom you were involved in the dispute for the rest of your life. In contrast, in New Guinean traditional societies, the emphasis in dispute resolution is on emotional closure, because in traditional societies where you don't move around, you know that you're going to have to deal with that person. They'll be in the village or next door for the rest of their life, and therefore, who cares about right and wrong and how much that pig was worth? What really counts is being able to restore emotional closure between the divorcing husband and wife or between the angry enemies in adjacent villages. And this is an area where there's a movement in Western society called restorative justice that attempts to combine the virtues of our state court systems with a monopoly on force and traditional societies that seek emotional closure. And the final example that I wanted to mention, again, a practical experience, involves the increasing terror of old age, namely Alzheimer's disease and the other dimensions of old age, which seem untreatable. And there are suggestions deal with by playing bridge or Sudoku, but that turns out not to help. In fact, the most surprising discovery that I made in the course of work on my recent book, The World Until Yesterday, is the only protection against Alzheimer's that we know about, and it's come out in the last 5 years, and that is being bilingual or multilingual. A study in Canada in the last 5 years showed that bilingual or multilingual people get, on the average, 5 years of protection against developing symptoms of Alzheimer's if they can develop them at all. And conversely, for a given level of organic brain lesions, you have to have more severe brain lesions if you're bilingual to develop symptoms than if you are monolingual, meaning that you have to have more organic damage. You're protected against the damage. And the reason, of course, is that multilingualism is the most constant exercise that the brain can have, similar to the exercise of working out. And working out for the brain is the best protection that one can get against symptoms of Alzheimer's and other dementias. So in short, traditional societies are thousands of natural experiments in how to organize a human society. They're experiments in which we can learn, not only experiments from which we can learn about how to minimize dangers for the future, but also from which we can learn about bringing up our children, staying healthy, and avoiding dementias. Thank you.